Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. So, Tim, did you have a Super Bowl party this weekend?
I did not have a Super Bowl party after the 49ers stopped playing in the fourth quarter of the NFC Championship game. I did not care much anymore about the Super Bowl, though I did eat, all of the awful things that you do eat during the Super Bowl.
I'm not a sports fan, but I did catch the fourth quarter and I noticed that very few people were wearing masks. And in LA County, the indoor mask mandate still applies, even though the state is lifting them, I think, as of tomorrow. So I looked in the papers this morning and a lot of celebrities, LeBron James, Jennifer Lopez, Ben Affleck, Matt Damon, they're all caught on camera without their mask.
I mean, nobody was wearing a mask. Somebody posted a picture of Mayor Garcetti talking to people, and the caption was, "Boy, he's setting a new record for being able to hold his breath." And that's the whole thing about it. I mean, it's just become absurd. And you would have thought, especially the mayor, after the flack he caught last week, wouldn't you be the one guy wearing them? But it just kind of shows the hypocrisy and lack of common sense on this across the board.
Well, I'm afraid that we'll still be in mask in LA County until about March, which is what the public health director, Barbara Ferris, said. So, and that's if we're lucky. So we're still looking at a few more weeks. What about in Sacramento and San Francisco?
Well, from what I understand, Sacramento is going to align with California dropping the mask requirement on the 15th. So I don't know. I think I will still wear them until I go through my stash. I've spent a lot of money on these masks. I want to make sure they don't go unused.
I did too. And I bought a lot of those tests too. And they were so hard to find. So I was hoarding them. But now I've got all these tests and they do expire. So you kind of have to be careful. And I got amazingly enough, I got my 2 kits from the government. They came in the mail. So I've got plenty of test kits now and lots of masks.
So masking aside, let's talk about the game, the halftime show. It was not my cup of tea, but certainly everybody on social media thought it was the greatest halftime show ever. And I always, when it's declared such, even before the game, I always kind of take that with a grain of salt. And usually I'm a contrarian trying to find fault with the show. I think I would have liked Paul McCartney or the Rolling Stones better as a choice than the bunch that we had up there. What did you think?
Well, I saw it. I watched it on my computer, and it was billed as rap meets hip hop, and I wasn't sure which one was rap and which one was hip hop. Frankly, I sort of missed the whole rap hip hop era. It's still going on. It had tremendous legs, so I probably should get with a program, but perhaps it's too late for me.
I was just happy that I actually knew most of the songs and the artists, so I was very proud of myself.
Oh, yeah, and the artists look middle-aged to me, Tim, so I don't know. You know more of the songs and the artists than I do, but they all look sort of like, well, you're younger than I am, but they look like our age.
Yeah, well, somebody said that they used to see when they'd see the Rolling Stones or the Who doing the halftime show, they would say, "Oh, what a nice kind of bit of nostalgia for the baby boomers watching." And then when they heard that, Snoop Dogg and Eminem and Dr. Dre and all of them were performing at this Super Bowl halftime show, thought, what a cool show. And then it dawned on them, this is the first show that's nostalgia for them.
So what about the Olympics? Speaking of sports. So have you been watching the Olympics? We've got an upcoming blog. I kind of suspected this, that these Olympics have the worst ratings ever. I believe that because I haven't really been watching them, but I have been streaming the various events. And I've only been streaming the events where the athletes that have taken medals, and I've kind of put off the oddball sports like curling and things like that. So I wonder if my streaming view counts as a live view, or if that's in the ratings. If they weren't counted, I wouldn't be part of those ratings. And so many people stream now.
Yes, there are services that measure the streaming. It's a little bit of a Wild West because in some ways it's up to the streaming companies to disclose their viewership data, but there are services that do measure streaming. And then obviously the networks tout how many people are streaming because they need to show advertisers who are spending the hundreds of millions of dollars to pay for the rights and help them make money, hopefully, that yes, even though people aren't watching traditional TV, they're watching on their phone or watching when they're not at home. I will say, though, I have been good watching. My favorite Winter Olympic sports is curling. So I have been cheering on the men and the women, and our great gold medal team is fighting hard to repeat here in Beijing, and they had an important win on Sunday, so we will see. And the women have been doing very well. They were 4-2, so hopefully they will both get into the medal round, and I don't know, maybe one or both teams could repeat, could be on the podium this year.
Well, my favorite, of course, is figure skating. And, there is that scandal about the young woman who is a beautiful skater from the Russian Olympic Committee, which still irks me because they should not be in the Olympics because of that drug scandal. But they're all performing, and
they ruled that she can perform. I guess it was how they appealed the case. So they basically cleared her to be in I guess tomorrow night is the first night of competition for the women. So yeah, they ruled overnight.
It still bothers me that the Russians are competing thanks to that doping scandal. And what is a deterrence of doping? That's very disappointing. You wrote a great blog about the cost of the Olympics and that it's coming to LA County in 2028.
Before you know it, if you thought the Super Bowl was fun, wait till we have our 16 days of glory back in Los Angeles in 2028. And, I think more staggering than whatever the TV ratings are and the great competition that we see and the awe-inspiring performance by the athletes, it's the cost of the games. And, the 2022 Olympics in Beijing, they are reusing a lot of the facilities that Beijing constructed for the 2008 Summer Games. However, despite, I know we should be surprised that the Chinese government is not being 100% open and honest with the book. They're trying to say that it's only costing $3.9 billion, but Insider reports that the actual cost for the games is something closer to $38.5 billion. And, what you're seeing is all of these various recent games, the price tags to build the facilities and the infrastructure are just out of control. And it makes you wonder, is it really worth the effort? In some countries, if you look at Athens and Rio, a lot of these facilities are completely abandoned right after the game. So I looked up, what will it cost to build the LA games? Now, we do have advantages that we have the infrastructure that's already in place. We have a lot of the facilities like the SoFi Stadium for the Super Bowl, which will host, it's actually going to be a dual hosting of the opening ceremony between the LA Coliseum and SoFi Stadium. But it's projected that it'll cost about $6.9 billion. And that went up in the most recent estimate by about $700 million because we agreed to wait until 2028. Now, the Olympic Committee says all these costs will be paid for by sponsorship dollars, ticket sales, private investment, etc. But that doesn't really tell the whole story. Taxpayers, both in the city and statewide, would, by the terms of the agreement, be on the hook for the cost overrun. Security, that's always the federal government picks up the tab for security. That's going to be a huge cost, multi-billion-dollar cost for security. And then, of course, they'll have to hire additional, local city police officers and county sheriff's deputies. There's also huge transportation infrastructure costs that are being accelerated to be ready for the games.
Yeah, we're suffering through that now because LAX is a royal mess, and I do everything I can to avoid landing at LAX with that new people mover thing that they're building.
Yeah, there's going to be allegedly about $42.9 billion in various transportation infrastructure projects over the next 6 years until 2028 games. So it could be a real mess, as they race to get these projects built. And certainly it probably is a little more expensive given the acceleration of time. So it kind of begs the question, is it worth all of this investment? One fellow, Andrew Zimbalist, who is the gold source for all research and analysis on kind of sports venues. And he makes the case, why are we building all of these, spending all these billions of dollars in these different cities every year? We should just pick a place, build all the Olympic infrastructure, and just go there every 2 or 4 years. That makes a lot of sense to me.
That's the case. I would vote for Greece, the site of the original Olympics. And as you say, some of those facilities are already decaying.
That's right. That's right. It's stunning to see. If you Google them, you can't believe that, this was a major Olympic venue 15 years ago.
So our guest on this podcast is Steve Smith, and Steve just joined us at PRI. He's going to be writing and researching crime and public safety issues. He was a former police officer. He ran Gavilan College's Administration of Justice program for many years, and he's now a security consultant. So really, Tim, the rising crime in California and major cities across the country compelled us to bring an expert on board.
I think listeners will really find his perspective very timely and interesting, that he has that front line perspective, both from an on-the-line officer perspective to the academic perspective. And all of these issues related to criminal justice policy are only going to heat up in California, in the coming years. They've already been at the top of the agenda recently. So we talk through some of the current and recent hot issues, and we look ahead to the future. So I think you'll enjoy hearing Steve, and I think you'll enjoy reading his commentaries going forward.
So thanks, everyone, for joining us. Here's Steve. Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast, Steve.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
So, Steve, we're pleased to welcome you to PRI as our new senior fellow who will be writing about public safety issues. But before we dive in, share with our listeners a little bit about your background and the perspective you bring to the debate over criminal justice policy in California.
Sure, and thank you for asking. So I began my career in public safety back in 1988, right after I graduated from Sacramento State. I became a municipal police officer in Scotts Valley. I was a deputy sheriff in San Benito County, and I was also a district attorney's investigator here in Santa Cruz County. All told, I have just about 28 years on the job. In addition, I worked with the UN in Bosnia, where I was a station commander with the International Police Task Force there in 1998. I've also trained police officers in Serbia and the West Bank.
And Steve, you were also an academic. You taught criminal justice at a community college. Is that right?
I did. I was tenured faculty at Gavilan College down in Gilroy, which is where I had also gone to the police academy. So it was kind of a nice end to my career, bringing me full circle back to where it all began, which is where I went to the police academy.
The initial focus of your work has been the rising incidence of crime in San Francisco, which really is garnering national attention. Your initial blog post criticizes the political worldview espoused by writers for the San Francisco Chronicle and others, that all of these rising crime rates and incidents that we're seeing in the city by the Bay, it's really no different than what's going on in other major cities in California and across the country. So in your view, why are things so dramatically worse compared to even across the Bay in Oakland or across the state in Los Angeles or other major cities that are notorious for their high crime rates?
Well, I mean, a little bit of it is, dog bites man or man bites dog. Nobody's terribly surprised that the East Bay cities of, Oakland and Richmond, have a crime problem. And I don't mean to make light of it when I phrase it like that. But San Francisco had always been a place apart, close in proximity, but far in terms of crime. It's a fairly concentrated city with a large police force, that, did a good job keeping a lid on things for a lot of years. And then, of course, since, the rollout of a number of criminal justice reforms, beginning with AB 109 realignment back in 2011, and then moving on to Prop 47 and Prop 57, as well as a de facto decriminalization of drug use, we see now the consequence of that, in my opinion. Drug use may appear to be a victimless crime or, a crime of the offender alone. Drug users commit a lot of crimes in order to finance their drug use. And a lot of those crimes are theft crimes. And I think that's why we see that huge spike in burglaries in San Francisco.
Steve, you recently wrote in a very interesting piece for PRI's Right by the Bay blog, where you break down the latest crime statistics in San Francisco. So you make the case that despite the new data, which is already very worrisome, crime victimization is actually much higher than reported. Explain to our listeners, as you put it in the title of your blog, what crime reports and rates don't tell us.
Sure. We know through comparing crime rates to crime victimization that there's a gap, and it's known in academic circles as the dark figure of crime. One of the points of data that we use is the National Crime Victimization Survey, emphasis on the word survey. So this is something conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, wherein they contact a random sample of the American population and ask them about their victimization. And in so doing, they know that there's an overall about a 59% underreporting phenomenon out there. So while nationally there's 8.9 million reported crimes, we know because of the NCVS data, there's also 8.9 million unreported crimes.
We've seen the election of so-called woke prosecutors like Chesa Boudin and George Gaston, and their tenure has led to dramatically different approaches in those cities to prosecuting, if you could call it prosecuting. As we discussed with Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert on our podcast last year, in her view, these prosecutors seem to be pushing more of a political agenda rather than what's in the best interests of public safety and justice. So what are your thoughts on the approach of district attorneys like Boudin and Gascon, and what would it mean for public safety in California if their philosophy spreads to other DA offices after the 2022 election?
Well, I think that San Francisco is sort of the canary in the coal mine. Mr. Boudin, being a former public defender, brings a very, different perspective to crime in the criminal justice system. I think essentially he views people who commit crimes as victims, of an unfair system, both economically and socially. And in order to move them out of their criminality, as an advocate for, treatment or in fact decriminalization of many of what he considers minor offenses. In San Francisco, Mr. Boudin, the DA, who's the chief law enforcement officer of the county, San Francisco is a city and a county, comes out of the public defender's office. The head of the police commission comes out of the public defender's office, and they bring a defense orientation to the criminal justice problem. And that's one that's offender focused rather than victim focused.
Steve, I read that the recidivism rate for crime is about 50%, which you would think that we ought to do better and do a better job at rehabilitating those who commit crimes rather than let them off the hook, which is what a lot of these prosecutors are doing.
Yes, you're correct. The California recidivism rate seems to be stuck at 50%. One of the problems with AB 109 realignment was a shift of low-level felony offenders back out to the counties where they offended. So in effect, what we did is push the burden of incarcerating and rehabilitating them onto the counties. If I can say anything good about the prison system, is that prisons were clearinghouses for services. They could, because of their size, bring a host of rehabilitative programs to their population, something that's not possible at the county level, particularly at smaller counties. The idea that a tiny county like Modoc County could provide wraparound social and rehabilitative services for their inmates, is a little bit laughable. So I think we're stuck at that recidivism rate because of AB 109 and realignment, that the counties just don't have the resources, particularly California's many very small counties, to rehabilitate inmates.
That's a great point, Steve. There's been a growing trend in big cities in California and now in other states of rampant shoplifting on the rise. Things are so bad that many chain stores like CVS are choosing to close their locations rather than deal with all the crime. Many have pointed out to a dramatic shift in public safety policy over the past decade with the enactment of the Prison Realignment Law, AB 109, and Props 47 and 57 as a main culprit for the increase in shoplifting. What's your view? Are the rising incidents of shoplifting the result of these policy changes, or is something else going on here?
Well, absolutely, yes. Thieves do a cost-benefit analysis. They evaluate the risk of getting caught for the crime against the benefit that they get from stealing the item. And because of that dark figure, for example, we know that a big chunk of the crimes they commit are not going to get reported. So they have about a 50-50 chance that the victim isn't going to report the crime. And then, you have to overlay the decision that stores have to make in terms of how much risk they want to take, right? I happen to know some private security companies working in San Francisco who are finding that their officers are getting assaulted when they're guarding stores like Walgreens and CVS and smaller retailers. So that tells me that the risk of getting caught is very, very low indeed, given the chance they're willing to take, in taking on, relatively secure stores. Prop 47, reduced thefts of less than $950 to misdemeanors. And that included guns, by the way. And that's probably an issue for a different question, but it makes it difficult, right? Contrary to what the governor says, multiple misdemeanors are not stackable and can't be charged as felonies. So all they can do is prosecute misdemeanor count by misdemeanor count by misdemeanor count. And that, just makes it very difficult to hold these people accountable.
Yeah. And, if the public isn't reporting them because they don't think that the police will do anything about it, it's just sort of a downward spiral.
It is. It's part of the cost of prosecution is, are the victims willing to participate, right? Are they willing to pay staff to take the time off to testify in court? Sometimes, because of the high turnover in retail employment, the witness to the crime no longer works at the store anymore. So that makes it problematic to put these cases together because they don't go to trial until some months after the crime was committed. In addition to that, a lot of stores don't want to take on the liability risk of physically arresting people because of the risk of injury and a potential lawsuit afterwards. So they make the business decision, not to participate in the criminal justice system.
So another big public safety policy shift, believe it or not, has been COVID-19. And we literally saw during the height of the pandemic, mass release orders at the state and local levels to, quote unquote, protect inmates from contracting the virus. So is the release in so many offenders all at once also to blame for this rise in crime that we're seeing in California? And what do you think will be the long-term impact of these early release orders on public safety?
COVID caused us to do some, pretty crazy things initially. I remember here in Santa Cruz, deputies ordering surfers out of the ocean because of the perceived risk of spreading COVID. Looking back on that now, based on the science, we know that's pretty absurd. And I think the rush to empty out jails and prisons because of the risk of COVID transmission was equally absurd. What we know now is those inmates were actually cohesive groups, and the chance of infection was relatively low. Over the course of COVID, for 2 years now, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation has reported only 249 COVID deaths. And in Santa Clara County, they've only had one. Meanwhile, outside, there have been 80,000 COVID deaths in California, which tells me that the COVID threat inside the institutions was overestimated. Part of what happens when people are incarcerated is they have to, click up or become part of a group inside the institution. Sometimes, even though they are being held for nonviolent offenses, their behavior inside the institutions actually can become violent. And that's a consequence of incarceration that none of us like. And the CDCR is trying, hard to reduce violence inside the institutions, but it's there. In addition, inmates who are sent to prison, 95% of the time are there on a plea bargain. And that plea bargain involves a reduced charge and or a reduced sentence. So that while their commitment offense may look relatively non-serious, the facts of their case may in fact be more serious. And that means in the rush to, discharge inmates, we may be underestimating the sophistication of their criminality and the level of danger that they present. And I think we can roll back the clock all the way back to 2011 and see that a lot of the inmates that were released shouldn't have been.
So PRI has written extensively about California's growing homeless crisis. From what you've seen, how much of a factor is homelessness, especially those who are mentally ill or battling substance abuse, in contributing to rising crime and violence and more Californians living in fear in their neighborhoods and communities? Also, what are your thoughts, as our scholars have written about in our recent book, No Way Home, on the role that public safety officers can play in helping to connect homeless on the streets to shelter and services and hopefully get them the care they need?
Well, it's classic community policing. People sometimes wrongly assume that the only role police officers have in the community is to identify criminal acts and, conduct investigations and make arrests, when in fact, I think the police officers are part of the social service system. They're excellent gatekeepers. They know their communities. They know the people who live in them. They know the assets that a community has in terms of, servicing those people. They're very connected to the agencies that want to be connected to law enforcement, and can help, people that are on the street and people who have drug problems, find their way to those programs.
Sitting here in Sacramento, we're seeing the 2022 legislative session really just starting to kick into high gear. And as we've seen in recent years, public safety policy is sure to be at the top of the agenda in Sacramento and probably some of the most high-profile debates that we'll have this year. In recent years, we saw that legislation to limit the use of deadly force by police officers, for example, garnered national media attention. So what are some of this year's hot public safety bills that you're following at the state capitol?
Well, I'm looking at 3 assembly bills, the 1597, 1599, and 1603, as all of them relate to modifying Prop 47 to hold thieves more accountable. What I'm disappointed that I don't see is any legislation that will increase the theft of a handgun under $950 in value to a felony, which I think is one of the central flaws to Prop 47. A $250 gun kills just as effectively as a $1,000 gun. And I think it's pretty absurd that we have reduced the theft of a gun, which used to be a felony in all cases, to a misdemeanor linked to that theft value of $950.
Steve, criminal justice reform that focuses more on the rehabilitation of inmates has been a driving force of policy in both Sacramento and Washington in recent years. We discussed this issue last year on our podcast with Pat Nolan, who has devoted his life to promoting faith-based inmate rehabilitation programs. So there seems to be two schools of thought between advocating for responsible criminal justice reforms and the efforts by some progressives to abolish the police and wipe off strong policy safety protections from the books. In your view, how do we strike a balance between protecting society from violent offenders and reforming our sentencing laws?
Well, I think we need to have treatment that works. I'm familiar with Pat Nolan and his work, and I'm also familiar with Mimi Silber and her amazing work with the Delancey Street Foundation, which was founded right here in San Francisco. Mimi used to joke that she was the Harvard of crime. Harvard takes the top performing, academic people in the country and turns them into scholars. She takes the bottom 10% and has similar success. She does that, or she says that a bit tongue in cheek, but she has a better than 80% success rate, which means her recidivism rate is only 20% for the people who participate in her program. And I think it's an excellent example of the private sector, which Delancey Street is. They don't accept government funding, they don't have employees, and they rely on the businesses that Delancey Street runs and donations, from people with good hearts to fund a program that's really been successful. So I think that there's a lot of room for partnerships in the private sector to help these people out. And there's a lot of expertise out there. And, no police officer wants to deal with the same problem over and over and over again, or the same person, over and over again. We call it the revolving door. Police officers want to believe that the system, will rehabilitate the people that they bring into the system. And, for example, I was a serving officer, was also a member of the board of Triad Community Services down here in Santa Cruz, and we operated the methadone clinic, which treated up to 250 heroin addicts. Police officers are very much involved in rehabilitation programs, and we want to see them be successful to break this cycle.
So before I ask our last question, we had interesting poll results come out recently with the PPIC, their latest poll on Californians and their government. They asked people's attitudes about crime, and 64% said that violence and street crime are a problem in their local community. So when you see numbers like that, they also said, once again, of the top issues facing the state, crime is now once again one of the top 4 issues, which it hadn't been for a while. So when you see numbers like that in public opinion polling, does that give you hope that Californians might be starting to wake up and are begin to demand some changes in our public safety policy?
I agree, absolutely. Back in the mid to late 80s and early 90s, California was passing some, pretty robust criminal justice legislation, namely 3 strikes and, and Megan's Law. And we saw a corresponding, decrease in crime. In fact, an amazing decrease in crime that leveled out right around 2011. And I think people believed that decrease would increase, and then maybe it was time to look at rehabilitation programs and find ways to correct some social, injustices in the system. But in so doing, they lost focus of the things that work. I think now what people are seeing is that stability has gone away and that crime is increasing, particularly homicides, which is really disturbing because it's a steep spike upwards, 30% in some jurisdictions. And that scares people. And then in terms of quality of life, people see, tent cities, they see open air drug use, they see litter, they see, defecation, and those quality of life issues influence voters in a really profound way. And I think we may be heading in that direction.
Well, finally, with all of this depressing talk, I think we might need a drink. So we call our podcast Next Round because PRI is so close to wine country, and we love nothing more than discussing public policy while enjoying a glass of wine. So what beer, wine, adult or otherwise beverage do you enjoy while you're trying to take your mind off all these rising incidents of crime in our once golden state?
Well, being from Santa Cruz County, I'm a big fan of our local products. And here in Scotts Valley, the Alfred Hitchcock estate called Heart of the Mountain makes an excellent Pinot Noir that I enjoy. And likewise, I'm a fan of the Humble Sea Brewery, which makes a number of great IPAs on the west side of Santa Cruz.
Thank you so much, Steve.
You're welcome.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.